In last week's discussion with the CEO of Hemlane, we really got into her vision for the company, the technology, and really changing property management forever. That conversation was so well received. I thought we should do a dedicated conversation to her vision for the landlord, the owner, but also the tenant. Because I think what you're going to see with Hemlane is it goes both ways, and it is her vision and leadership that is changing property management forever. Dana, the show last week people really loved, so let's give them more.
Great. I want to start by just talking about the stigma associated with both owning rental properties as well as being a tenant. Because I think that's a really important point or trend.
Mhm.
Sometimes I hate using these large companies that everyone's heard of, but there are some good parallels, especially with the taxi industry
Yeah,
before
I agree.
Uber, right? Being a taxi driver is like, oh, they're a taxi driver. There was this negative stigma associated with it. And it's interesting, you don't get the same thing with Uber drivers, right? I got picked up. My last Uber was a Tesla that I got picked up in, right? There's
Mm,
a totally different branding associated with it. And one of the shames that I saw back in, 2010 and 2011 and 13, when, by the way, it was like a fantastic time to buy
yeah.
rentals, was there are people who just don't get into it because of that stigma. And you hear that
Mm,
so often. I don't want to be a landlord. When I hear landlord, I think slumlord. And
mm,
you hear that a lot, and it gets a bad rap. And then on the tenant side, there's also a stigma associated with being a tenant.
mm.
And it's, oh, I'm a tenant. I can't afford a home to live in. And that's honestly actually changed as well. Because there's a lot of tenants who say, no, I don't want to get locked into living in one
Right.
place. And that is why I'm renting. And so I think for me, when you think about like the vision and the real estate industry and really what Hemlane stands behind and what we want is to just completely eliminate that. Make
Mhm.
it where there aren't questions about how much money someone has or someone's intentions as a landlord, but more a really positive environment and place for you to one, have passive income, and two, for tenants to have a great experience. And so a lot of that we thought about when we built it into Hemlane. And I do want to start with the tenant because, Michael, we don't talk about the tenant enough.
No,
And
and to be clear, I think that's one of the things that sets Hemlane apart is a lot of, again, I've been in the software industry a long time. A lot of folks just focus on the person that's paying them. And in your model, the tenant doesn't pay. It's the owner,
yeah,
obviously, if it's not obvious. So why would you focus on the tenant? They're not a revenue stream. Again,
yeah,
that's what makes Hemlane unique.
yeah. For us, it sort of is a revenue stream because a happy real estate investor
Yeah.
is, the saying on Hemlane
Yeah.
is
You're
happy
going around the
Hemlane.
fence to get there,
Yeah.
but I see how you got there.
Yeah, it is. So for us, retention is huge for an owner. Like having a tenant who stays in a property long term or has a great
Absolutely.
experience with Hemlane, they'll want to continue to rent. They'll start looking at other options if they're like, hey, this is not ideal. And I'll give you a couple examples. I have actually quite a few friends who they could buy a house even now with where the interest rates are. And they say, no, because I don't want to repair the dishwasher. I
Yeah.
don't want to have to worry about all of the things that break in the house. It's actually delightful to be a tenant. And so we want tenants to have that delightful experience. And I'll give you a couple of examples of it. The first is our customer success. So if you are a tenant, when you call our phone number, you get routed to the same people that an owner gets routed to.
Hmm.
Mm,
Wow.
I don't think any other company does that. There's no like if you're
No,
a
why
tenant,
would they? The
press
scale of that?
one. Yeah,
Yeah.
if you're a tenant, press one. If you're an owner, press two. And you have like a
Mm.
worse experience, or you'll go to the newbie team if you're a tenant.
Yeah.
That's not what
Yeah.
happens.
Understaffed team. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's actually the same. And it's the same when there's any like when they have the chat on their side of the app, it goes to the same exact team that it does for owners.
Wow.
And the reason for that we have found is that a tenant is if they have a bad experience with Hemlane, they're going to tell the owner, right? I contacted the support. I was on the call for, an hour or whatever it is. And so for us, we've just never had that happen because we treat them like a customer and give them that same support. So that's the first thing.
Hmm.
The second that I think is big is repair coordination and repairs. Because with a tenant, they just want expectations set. And what I found is like actually the most difficult customers slash tenants are actually some of my favorite because they've helped us make the platform
Yeah.
so like I would say bulletproof, if that's maybe a good word, of like nothing can get by and everything is really clearly outlined and articulated, everything from the language and expectations to responsibilities and who's assumed to do what. And so a lot of times if a tenant is angry, like for example, the service professional showed up 20 minutes early or 20 minutes late, to me it's okay, great. This is a another platform maybe like, well, at least the service professional showed
Yeah,
up,
at least they
right?
got there.
At least they showed up. For us, actually, it's one of those things where we use that to say, great, how do we over communicate on that? How
Yeah.
do we make sure they know beforehand if someone's running late? How do they know that, if they aren't there and they've scheduled the appointment, there may be a cancellation fee and they
Yeah.
understand that up front. So there's no surprises later on. And so I think a lot of that is built into the platform and it's built for the tenant, but it helps the owner. So the owner has no idea about a lot of these. They don't see the tenant experience.
Right.
So they don't see that all of this is built into it. All they know is the repair request is being handled. It's being handled well. And then at the end, we give the opportunity for the tenant to rate us and the owner. And
Ah,
it's out of
interesting.
5 stars, but if there's anything of 3 or below, they get a call right away from a manager to understand what happened, what went
Again,
wrong,
tenant
what could
or
we
owner with a
tenant or owner,
three-star or
yes.
less. Again,
Yes.
that's differentiating what you're doing with Himlane because that's not cheap, right? Those are all bodies, those are all hours, those are all
Yeah.
minutes. That's
Yeah.
cost.
It's not like the call is coming from someone who is not the repair coordinator or the manager themselves. It's actually coming from that person. And so I think that helps because it puts this level of excellence on our team. It also puts a level of excellence on all of the service professionals we use because they, to some extent, are the face of Hemlane. They're the ones who are going out, even though they're third party, they're not Hemlane. Anyone going out to the property, whether it's the owner service professionals or someone within our own network, that is going to be a representation of it. And so
Mhm.
I think that that differentiation really comes to just saying, hey, everyone we treat as if they are, walking into a 5-star hotel. How do you give them that type of experience? And so that's really what we focused on. And what we found with it is it's hard to change people's perceptions on industries.
Sure.
It takes a long time, but when you build something that's totally different, people do suddenly come to you and say, "Wow, that was a phenomenal experience. That was great." And it
Yeah.
changes slowly over time as you get more and more of that.
No, I like it. I actually have and you may not know this, but you'll take a swag, I'm sure. When you look at the engineering hours over the last 5 years, what percent would you guesstimate were aimed at the tenant?
Great question. It's usually about like 35%, I would say.
Uh,
And that's a
okay.
total estimate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um a lot of that has to do with things like showings. How do you provide them a better experience
Yeah.
for
Well,
managing
repair
showings,
coordination, all of that's
repair coordination, all of
yeah.
that? However, at the beginning, it wasn't. At the beginning, it was more of 65, 70% on the tenants. And the only
Oh,
reason
wait, 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 wait. In the beginning,
in the
it was
beginning, we focused,
70% tenants?
yeah, because at the beginning,
Ah,
we were
got it.
not as focused on things like, for example, now we're focused on accounting. A
Right. The
tenant does
books,
not
the reports.
care
No.
about accounting at all.
Okay. All right.
They just care about paying their rent. And so a lot of the new services that we're coming out with and certain things like, for example, contracts for owners,
Mm. Yep.
those things are very focused on the owner. So sorry, I'm talking about this year is
Yeah, I
is
understand.
more
I understand.
owners.
Yep,
At
I
the
got you.
beginning, it was more tenants.
Well, that you know what? That makes sense to me. I don't know that I would have guessed that intuitively, but when you think about property management and you break it down to like where are the transactions,
Hmm.
there's clearly more transactions tenant in showings, repair requests, all of this. So that makes total sense that a lot of the engineering hours started there because again, you're trying to change the game. And again, back to my earlier point, tenants are non-revenue generating. At least one to one, they're not.
Yeah.
Right. But if you make that experience good, they become sticky. I get it. That's the long way to get there. But that's also why Hemlane's different. There's a lot of technology providers and a lot of people I know in the valley that would have only focused on
On
the
the
it's like,
owner side.
who's
Yeah.
who am I licensing? That's all they get. Yeah, we'll give the tenants like 5%, the junior people, the
Yeah.
interns that come in the summer. You did it different. And I think that's why Hemlane's changing the game. So go ahead, continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, I think it depends on what that product roadmap looks like. And you listen to your customers on both sides. You listen to what tenants say because we log, it's the same team taking the tenants' complaints as the owners. What's really interesting, or I shouldn't say complaints, but more of like support
Yeah.
questions. Because if someone, the most delightful customer service experience is never to reach out to customer service or customer success.
No, no,
The
of course
best
not.
experience is never to have to. The product just
Yeah.
takes you through everything. And so that's how we think of things. And because it's the same team getting the tickets from both, it's really interesting. We have more tenants, obviously, than owners
Of course.
because, there's an average of 2 tenants per every single property.
Mhm.
But what is interesting about it is we actually get more owner requests for things than tenants. And that
Okay.
to us is a signal that we've done well with the tenants to make sure they have a great experience in the
I
app.
agree. I
And so
agree.
that's having everything centralized and go to one team. That is the reason we do that, is to make sure we're holding ourselves accountable. Um, and then what I would say from the perspective, so we sort of spoke about the stigma associated with renting or being a landlord. People call them slumlords sometimes, etc. I think
Mhm.
there's two ways to change that. That kind of goes back to our vision and mission. Um, the first is that communication, over
Mhm.
communication, and how do you make sure that everyone understands what they're getting into, what expectations are, and most importantly, why. Like, tenant, why do you have to pay a service call if you're not there? Why
Right.
is it more advantageous for you to be there for the service call than to have a property manager go out? If the tenant's like, I'm at work, my sink, the water's not getting hot, and then you send a property manager out with a service professional on site and they're like, well, the water's hot,
Yeah.
it's not the person who reported it. And
Right.
so there's certain things like that that I think over communication is really, really important. I think the other thing when we think about Hemlane and how to make it a great experience on both sides is guardrails.
Mm.
I think guardrails are really, really important. A lot of times when there's miscommunication, it's because you didn't think 5 steps ahead of
Oh, yeah.
what was going to happen. I'll give you some examples. One would be pet fees. Pet fees have been something that, within the past 5 years, owners have started charging pet rent, pet deposits, etc.
Mhm.
A tenant gets pretty upset when that's not an advertising description, and then they're getting to the lease agreement and suddenly it's $50 per pet, and they're like, "Thanks so much for not telling me that."
Right.
And
Yep.
so I think having these guardrails of at every point explaining, "Here's what's gonna happen, here's why it's being, communicated at this time," and saying, "Oh, wait, but, in your state, there's certain things you can't do, like you can't charge pet rent that's that high or whatever."
Mhm.
Having these certain guardrails up is really, really helpful. Because then on both sides, you reduce the noise or communication, back and forth between them of a misunderstanding. Another example of that would be like noise complaints.
Mm.
So when a tenant moves in, it's talking about here in your county, you can look up what is quiet hours? What are the decibels for those quiet hours? Those types of things I think are just really important to set those expectations up front.
Yep.
and then make sure the tenants obviously are reading it and things like that. And so there's so much to do on the property management side on just that communication and setting up these trigger points where people know what's going to happen next. And then I think there's this other thing that's really interesting, that has come to surface, I would say, within the past 5 years, where it's this immediacy. In other
Mm.
words, tenants want things to happen right away. They're so used to texting you, Michael, and you responding right away, or whoever it is. And so for us, we've really done that with our team of staffing like 24/7, someone who is there to respond with SLAs of 2 hours, 4 hours, if it's an emergency, 1 hour, like depending on what the situation is. But the reason that I bring that up is I do think with AI, that will get even better.
Mm.
And you can complement your team, not replace your team, complement your team with certain things like that that will be able to help, as long as it's trained on fair housing and all of the tenant landlord laws and
Yeah.
everything else that goes into it. But I think that really helps with that immediacy of like, hey, we're going to help get things done and provide that 5-star experience.
Yeah. I love all of this. But let's switch to the owners. What are you doing there?
Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So on the owner side, this is something that, we haven't had it come up that anyone who's like an investor in Hemlane has brought it up, but maybe it would come up. We treat owners almost as if they're a huge B2B deal. So if you
Oh,
have one rental property, you get Zoom free onboarding support, all of that kind of stuff. You can get on like a demo with us. We'll help you show you how to set everything up. There's some folks who say, no, this is really simple. Like I can just do it on my own. There's others who have questions. They want to
yeah.
know how things work, what resources we have, et cetera. And what you'll see is even large companies, they start charging setup fees for
Yep.
onboarding, and they charge all sorts of things upfront for it. We found that's actually not a great way to do
No.
business. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, as a real estate investor, especially if you're starting out, you have 1 to 4 rental properties. The amount that you have in that bank account is usually the rent that you're collecting from the property. You put some sort of reserve in there. And for you, a huge upfront cost is not what you're looking for when you've been given the dream of
Yeah.
having cash flow. And so for us, it's keeping you long term and saying, hey, having that onboarding and setting you up right is going to keep you on the platform long term,
Yeah. It's an
has been
investment.
really
Yeah.
important for us. And so that's one thing that we do, is really like make sure that you're set up and set up for success.
Mm.
Um, so that's, I would say, probably one of the biggest. And then as far as other things that we do, it's this concept that every time I talk to a real estate investor, there's something that they don't know,
Mm.
whether it's like early termination, something about early termination, or on the advertising side, like which rental listing websites do most inquiries come in. Our whole our whole philosophy behind Hemlane is you shouldn't have to know that.
Mm.
That will be built in to the solution. And what we do is we just need to track, for us, what we call time to value.
Yep.
How quickly can we get you value? And so that's really from a product perspective, how we think about things. How do we immediately show you why Hemlane would be a better place to list your rental property than Zillow? How do we get you that first inquiry faster? Or, now it's on the accounting side. How do we get those first transactions in there so you can see what your cash flow statement looks like, et cetera? And so there's a lot of that obviously we continue to build in, but we really look at those metrics. And if a customer churns, they're getting a call. We're
Yep.
trying to figure out, even if they're selling their property, we want to know
Yep.
why they're selling their property.
Yeah.
All of that kind of stuff. So we really built that in there to really understand and listen to the customers. And um, there was a quote, I think it was from the Zappos CEO, but maybe it was someone else, where he said, you don't focus on revenue at all. You just focus on your customers. And
Yeah.
that is how we've built Hemlane, and that's how we'll continue to build Hemlane.
I love all of that. And what you even go one step further, you give out a 14-day trial. I strongly recommend folks, even if you have zero rentals, take the trial. understand the client side, understand the owner side. It's there for you. There's no reason not to do it. Where would they go get that?
Yeah, you can go to www.hemlane, HEMLANE.com, and just mention one rental at a time because you do get 20% off your first year, which is the biggest discount that we have.
Woohoo!
If you mention one rental at a time after that 14 days or
Very
during
cool.
the 14 days, whenever.
Whenever. Dana, you're amazing. I love what you're doing. I love how you attack the market. I love that Zappos quote, right? Focus on the customer and basically the revenue will take care of itself. So keep it up. You're changing the game for tenants and owners. We all appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael.